Hello, and thanks for tuning into the New Orchard Show. One of the themes that we'll be exploring on this show is the deindustrialization of the Western economies and rise of China and India as industrial manufacturing superpowers. Especially China, which unlike 10, 20 or 30 years ago is now capable of producing very well designed and engineered products across multiple categories. I think this is particularly evident in the EV space with emerging car brands like Li Auto, Xpeng, NIO and of course BYD, with massive integrated supply chains, ability to manufacture cheaply and output very high volume. We should not be surprised that the playing field is not level, and that consequently the incentives to make things from scratch in places like UK, New Zealand, most European countries, Australia, and even to some extent USA are not as optimal as they were, let's say, 50, 60 years ago. The West, simply put, got addicted to outsourcing production for different reasons, greed being one of them. Corporations seeking higher profit margins really salivated over the idea of having access to low-wage, offshore, unregulated production force. Once the first player moved that way, all others had to kind of follow to remain competitive, or at least that's how the story goes. So taking all of that into consideration, I'm always amazed that there are some people out there who are willing to have a red-hot go and start new ventures locally. And by locally in this case, I mean Australia. One such person, who's my guest today, is Dennis Savic, founder and CEO of Savic Motorcycles. His story is a story of a singular vision, resilience, perseverance, innovation, authentic partnership building, and going against the trend. It's quite fascinating what Dennis and his team were able to do over the last 5 years, and that is the reason why I really wanted to interview him. My guess and hope is that you'll find his story interesting and that you'll be able to learn something from him, perhaps even catch a bit of inspiration. Without further ado, let the man do the talking and tell you all about how it all started, what the product is, and where things are likely to go in the near future for Savic Motorcycles. Hi Dennis, very warm welcome to the show. I'm really glad we're finally talking. It's been this conversation has been on my mind for quite some time. You have a very interesting story and a very interesting product which we're going to unpack today. But before we get to the nitty-gritty, how about we start with a little introduction? Please tell me who you are, where you're from, how were you educated, and what led you to start the company, Savic Motorcycles?
Look, it's obviously a long story because this is something I've wanted to do since I was very, very young. But to kind of start right at the beginning and race through, my folks are from a small country called Bosnia. They were from the capital called Sarajevo, which I think a few people are aware of, and they immigrated to Sydney in 1990. I was born in 92, and that's where the Savic name comes from. And about 96, we moved over to WA because Sydney was a bit too busy for him, and so I grew up in WA, and that's kind of where the story starts, because my earliest memory is being in the backseat of the car, seeing a car out the window. I'm not going to say what make and model, but I looked at the car and thought it was just hideous, and I thought, okay, I have to make sure this doesn't happen ever again. And I think that's kind of where the passion for like automotive design started. And if you fast forward, a few years, I think I was about 6 or 7 then, it's my earliest memory. And then about 14, I was in school in a metalwork class, and I'd finished all my projects. So the teacher said I could just build whatever I wanted to build. And I'd always wanted to motorize my pushy. And I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. So I actually sketched up like a little mini chopper style bike, and worked out how much money I need, what materials I needed, took it to the teacher, really excited. And he said, no way, I'm not going to help you. You've got to be an engineer. And that's kind of what took me down the engineering pathway. So from high school, I went and studied engineering. After I finished my engineering degree, couple of weeks of playing GTA 5 on the couch, I got up and I said, right, I can get cracking now. And so started building bikes January 2015. And at the same time, I started working in oil and gas. It's the mining and oil and gas, two big industries in WA. So I got a job, gave me a little bit of money, and I basically put all of that money towards bike parts and fabrication and trying to work out how to build bikes. And so, that's kind of like the origin story. I guess from there, there's just a lot of bashing my head against the wall and, learning many, many, many lessons along the way. But yeah, I guess that's the inception of it.
Hey, you know what they say, big things have small beginnings. What I wanted to ask you on the back of what you just said is why did you pick electric architecture over internal combustion? Why, well, how did you make that decision?
So there's two main reasons. So I developed an interest and a passion in electric powertrain technologies when I was about 16. And I mean, I'm disclosing my age here, that's 16 years ago, right? And so, um, it wasn't really common 16 years ago to think that way. And people might hear that now and go, "Oh, no, that's just silly." But no, like even when I was at uni in 2014, last year at uni, everyone was kind of confused as to what my final year project was and why I was, trying to build an electric motorbike. So, to have that idea pretty early on, I've got to give my old man credit for that. Maybe he read an article somewhere and saw that I was interested in CAD and cars and stuff like that. So, we talked about it and maybe that's where it sparked. But, the two main things that drove me towards electrics was one, I knew about the instant torque and I just, dreamt and envisioned performance. And I just thought, oh, that's so exciting. Like, 'cause you can't do that in a petrol engine. And then the other part of it was it gave you freedom to design something different. Like if you're designing a vehicle, if it's not a car and it's a motorbike, it's heavily based around the internal combustion engine. They're normally used as stressed members. It's the heart of the whole vehicle, right? It's a propulsion technology. Whereas, with electric motorcycles, you can do weird things with the battery and the chassis and put the motor, in the wheel or in the center of the vehicle. In summary, the two main things that drove me towards electric was A, the performance and the power that I hypothesized, and then two, the freedom in the design and being able to just have a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, that's really interesting that this choice of architecture gives you more sort of liberty, more freedom, more flexibility to design and engineer a little bit differently out of the box. Let's talk about your first bike, your first unit, the first prototype. How did you go about putting it together? And what were some of the challenges, some of the obstacles you came across, and how did you manage to overcome these obstacles?
So I started building my first bike 2015. It was a Yamaha R1 conversion build. We kind of started doing two bikes at the same time. We did the Yamaha R1 and reverse engineering project, and then at the same time we were designing our ground up project that used the same powertrain that we were going to put in the Yamaha R1. So the R1 was kind of like the proving vehicle, and then we were just going to do a heart transplant and put that powertrain in a ground up build. So we built the R1, we rode it, it worked, it ran, and it was really exciting. And then we were doing some work, and I ended up dropping the battery pack, and there were cylindrical cells, and it was just totally busted. And it was like 6 grand's worth of batteries that I didn't have the money to replace. So we ended up just going forward with the ground up build and launching that. But the reality is, I didn't know how to weld. I wasn't a fabricator. I was an engineer. I knew how to build a pretty good spreadsheet, and that was about it. And so, but the other thing is, like didn't know how to solder. I had to learn that. Building a wiring harness, started, getting a couple of people together. So I knew nothing about leadership, even though I was quite interested in it. And um, that ground up build, that first one that we built, barely rolled, because all the fabrication was off, and I definitely developed an appreciation for metalwork at that point. So, it's hard to say what the biggest challenge was. I think all of it was really challenging. I think I had like 7 weeks of just utter burnout, at various periods through that year, because I was pulling like 100-hour weeks consistently. I was working full time at the same time, and I was also studying my MBA. I kicked that off at the same time too. So, I was a single man back then, so I had a lot of free time, and doing all of that definitely kept me out of trouble for the most part.
Oh, wow. So, on top of your full time 40-hour a week job, you started an MBA. And on top of that, you started this startup.
Yeah, still crazy.
That is very impressive. Did you get help from anyone at all, or were you a one man band for everything?
Look, I had a couple of great advisors at the time, and I started learning about how to engage mentors and advisors. We had maybe a handful of individuals that formed the initial team, and they all got a little bit of equity. Um, you know, could I have done it without them? Maybe. Probably would have taken me a bit longer, obviously. And it was a really great, you know, first experience at building a team. And looking back, there's definitely things I would have done differently, and definitely things I think, I did well out the gate. And then, yeah, I don't know. It was a really, I look back at it fondly, I suppose. I don't really regret anything.
I mean, naturally, going through an experience like this would be very, very transformational for you
Mm.
as a human being. So I'm glad to hear that you don't really have any regrets from over-indexing like this. When you first started, did you think about the financials? Did you think about getting investors in early, or was this purely an engineering slash scientific project? Like, I just want to build a thing.
I hypothesized at the outset that it's going to be a capital intensive business. And, you know, I, I don't come from a very, very wealthy background. My parents did an amazing job at, providing for me and my sister. We had everything we ever needed and wanted. So, what more can you ask for? We're very, very privileged in that way. Um, but, we didn't have the kind of money for someone to give something, a $500,000 crack at and see if it works out. There was just, no way. So I was going to need external investment. Initially, I sold my car and like all my other possessions that I didn't need to buy bike parts to get us through that first ground up build. And then from there, we raised about 70,000 from friends and family and built our next thing and launched that. And then we've probably done like 5 rounds of capital raising since. And getting the MBA, you know, I got a lot of feedback from a lot of people saying, how valuable is an MBA at such a young age and all this kind of stuff. And um, again, I hypothesize that having an MBA at a young age gives me a degree of credibility, you know. And and funnily enough, I've had probably 3 or 4 shareholders look at that and go, "Yeah, you've worked pretty hard, and even though you've probably got a lot of milestones, like you've got an MBA at like 20 something while doing all of this." Um, I think it's resulted in like maybe $500,000 in equity invested. So like maybe 10% of the equity we've had invested in us over the last 5 years. So it was a $25,000 investment on my part to generate $500,000, some 10 years later. So I'd say it was worth it. Not even 10 years, maybe 5 years later. So, yeah, ROI is not bad.
Yeah, that is a pretty good ROI indeed. When I was preparing for this interview, I obviously had a good look at your website. There's a section on your website where Savic Motorcycles describes itself as a leader, disruptor, and an innovator in the e-mobility space. Can I ask you to elaborate on how you embodied these qualities?
as a trained engineer, and an Australian. Maybe I'm a bit of a trained Australian. You're not really taught to you know embellish things, and you're supposed to be really, really humble. And it's definitely a skill a lot of Australian founders have to unlearn when they're looking for capital, especially if they're looking, in the US and stuff like that. Um, and so, we don't normally like to call ourselves leaders, but the reality is not many people in Australia are doing this, and there's only three competitors globally that are significantly better funded than us that are. Um, so it's still a very niche white space market. And I think the thing that makes our business really special is we've developed some pretty cool technology in-house, with quite limited resources. 95% of the vehicle that you see on our website is done by us in-house. Um, we kind of we engineered our own motor, battery pack. We worked with our inverter supplier to customize it to suit our needs. And because we've been so, I mean, I say this in the context of automotive, so underfunded for so long, we're very cost sensitive. And so our supply chain is actually one of our biggest pieces of our IP because we're able to produce vehicles profitably at low volume in an automotive space. It's just unheard of, and that particular secret sauce is very, very rare. And I mean, we've also been able to develop over-the-air updates for the bikes. We don't have a key that comes with the bike; it pairs with your phone in an app because we've developed our own cloud infrastructure. And it's just amazing, what our team has been able to do over the last 4 years. Um, so, I think that kind of wraps up how we embody those titles. Whether they're earned or not, I think is subjective.
I'm actually both very glad and very impressed that you've managed to carve out a decent profit margin at low production volume, because in mobility space, like actually in any category, that is a very, very difficult thing to do. So
Yeah.
truly well done. There's a couple of interesting things that you just said. One of which was that nobody is trying to do anything like this in Australia, but you
Hmm.
are. I mean, from my vantage point, places like US or even some of the European countries, the incentive structure, the taxing structure, the ability to recruit very high quality talent is superior there. So you don't seem to be interested in moving the company to one of those locations to really accelerate the developments and just scale things up, maybe more rapidly. I don't know, you tell me, like, what is the driver for you to keep the company out of Australia? You're very loyal to that vision, and you're very persistent with it. So my question to you is why?
I actually didn't see the US market as a particularly good one from the outset. Having been to the US at a young age, you see how far apart those cities are. It really is a collection of 50 countries in a way. And, Harley is America, through and through. And the question is, do you want to go into a market that is incredibly patriotic, which I think is great, but from a business perspective and a competition perspective, you're going to be the outsider, the foreigner with a European name competing against, a homegrown American brand, and full respect to Harley for, the brand that they have, right? So that was one reason why not to go to the US. But I mean, the question still stands: why not try and do it somewhere other than Australia? And look, in hindsight, maybe I should have, because you talked about incentive before. Raising capital from investors in Australia has been one of the most difficult things. I mean, raising capital for a hardware business is hard, period. It's just not as scalable as software, and your variable costs scale with your, revenue and volume. Whereas with software, you do the upfront development and then it's disproportionate. So it mathematically makes a lot of sense to invest in software. Um, But then we've also picked very hard hardware. It's an automotive product. We've got 35 suppliers that need to work in harmony. Um, so that tends to scare people. And then we're also in the automotive space. And what I've learned over the years is that investors invest in things that they are comfortable with, especially when it comes to bigger investments. Smaller angel tickets and more punty type investments. People are like, oh, I'll give this. This sounds cool. I'll just you know put it on 32 red on roulette, and hopefully I get 25 times my money. And but when you start looking for a bigger lead investor who is going to come on this journey with you, they need to really believe that it is going to be successful. And even if they think it's going to be successful, if they don't have that comfort in the area that you're in, it's a no-go zone. And the number of funds in Australia that have an open mandate for hardware is very small. And so then when you compound that with the number of people that might be comfortable with this type of business, it's like 3 funds, maybe. So we've definitely exhausted all our avenues. I've spoken to pretty much every VC in Australia, and we don't even try with VCs anymore. We've learned if we are a VC play, it's a very, very niche VC. So we mainly talk to individuals, angels, and family offices. That's kind of our core focus. And hopefully, over the next period, I'll say I need to be careful with what I'm forecasting, but I suspect we'll be in a position in 12 to 24 months time where we are profitable. We're turning over a profit, and that puts us in another investment category, and that's kind of like low end private equity. I'm really delving into the detail here, so I'm sorry if I've strayed from the question, but um, I think at that stage, our business really becomes viable for a larger fund to come in, put multiple seven figures on the table, buy into the business, because we'll have proven out all of our hypotheses, our models, our processes. And so, but getting to that point takes capital, so it's a chicken or the egg thing. So it's probably a good time to mention we're just about to launch another crowdsource funding round. We did one almost 18 months ago now, and it went really well. We were trying to raise capital privately from VCs and what have you, and we've had a little bit of interest, but a lot of people are saying, when you've delivered the first 50 or the first 20 or the first 100, but we need capital to do that. So we're going back to the crowdsource funding round or route, and we'll see how we go.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I kind of expected you to answer that question this way, though. We're building a very strange economy here in Australia, moving away from manufacturing things completely and deindustrializing and shifting towards a bigger and bigger service economy. Ford used to be here, and
Yeah.
they no longer manufacture out of Australia, and Holden is gone and Toyota is gone. Obviously, those brands do sell the product here, but that product is not made in Australia. It's made somewhere else. So things are trending in a strange direction, and I'm not entirely sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing for the country.
It's a really interesting thing, like the flow of capital and why are we deindustrializing. And I think industrialization almost look, I'm 32. I'm not a trained economist. I'm a trained Australian, right? So
Yeah, you are a trained Australian with an MBA.
yeah, yeah. Like I'm just going to speak out of hypothesis. It's like when we're looking at where we're going to manufacture things, it's a cost question, period. Because when you make something, you have to make it at a profit, and that's why anybody's in business. And so, um, the hourly rate in Australia is just too high. It doesn't matter. Like, I mean, it's an order of magnitude higher than a lot of countries, right? So, um, people complain, why don't we make things here? Why don't we make things here? And it's like that the economics just don't stack up. So then the question is, okay, how do we make things here? And what would it take? Well, either minimum wage is dropped by 50%, which I don't think is a great idea, or we heavily devalue the Australian dollar somehow and make it viable to make things here and export internationally. I mean, you look at all over the world, all the big brands, if they're not manufacturing in China, they're manufacturing in Cambodia or Taiwan or Vietnam, wherever the hourly rate is significantly less, and what their business does is capitalize on that disparity. And you asked why Australia, why not somewhere else? And we outsource all of our component manufacture internationally. I'm not going to say it's one country in particular. It's probably across 7 different countries, and we import all those parts in separately, and we plan on assembling in Australia. And that's about as good as you're going to get, and that only works if you get the assembly time down to as low as possible. So we've designed the vehicle to be very quick and easy to put together to continue assembling things here. And maybe in time with scale and automation, we can start making components here as well. And I think the government did the right thing, going back a little while and putting out a lot of grants for automation and setting up, robotics in businesses to kind of keep the headcount or drop the headcount lower for the same amount of output, and that kind of offsets, that variable cost. But sorry, I've gone on a completely different tangent. But why did I why did I stay in Australia? I love my family. I love being close to home. Australia is like the best place to live, man. Like it is. There are very few like I've had the luxury and the privilege of traveling and seeing a lot of different countries, and Australia really is such a great place to live, and work. And I've got a young family now. To raise a family, it's safe. The weather's insane. I mean, you're from the UK. Why did you choose Australia?
I didn't really choose it. It's the country chose me, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of land, and people who live here, they're very lucky people. Hey, I want to talk to you a little bit about the demand and the size of the market. Obviously, if you go back 10 years, there's a lot of hype around EVs because of what Tesla was doing. They started, building Model S, and then shortly after that, Model X, Model 3, Model Y. All the other OEMs were observing that, and especially the Koreans got very quickly into the game. But then also you've got brands like Polestar, who used to be a tune-up shop for Volvo, now a brand, an electric vehicle brand in its own right. So the future looked bright. It looked like everyone wanted an electric vehicle. But now in 2024, this is starting to change. And people are starting to lean more towards hybrid vehicles for numerous reasons. And we don't really need to get into that. But I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the hype around electric motorbikes and the size of the market, maybe here in Australia and in APAC, if you can.
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's definitely two parts to that question. There's that the macroeconomic, conditions and demand for EVs, and then there's the motorcycle aspect of it. So um, the motorcycle side of things, when we look at the market in our business, we look at the whole market. Um, and when I say the whole market, I mean we don't just look at what the current EV market is, because the current EV market's minuscule. When you look at the overall market, it's huge. So I think there's a real disparity there, and it's definitely an emerging market. So I don't consider, today's EV motorcycle sales to be representative of what the demand will be, or, probably is. I think and the economics for motorcycles and cars are different when it comes to demand as well. So cars and electric cars are definitely becoming a lot more commoditized. There's, a lot of players in the space now. They all have EV offerings and they're all coming to market and what have you. Whereas with bikes, there's only a few available in the performance space, and those that are available are hugely expensive. And so, where we try and differentiate ourselves is by being direct to customer, like the Tesla model, and offering a product with a great specification at a reasonable price, right? For the same price of a brand new 1000cc petrol vehicle, give or take. So, whereas, and that means that we're about 30% cheaper than our direct competition in Australia. It's going to vary market to market. And so, and that's kind of how bikes and cars differ. As far as macroeconomic demand, there's a few things that have happened. It's kind of two really big things that have happened in 2024 that are likely impacting electric vehicle sales. One is governments aren't necessarily pushing as hard as they were. So, well, I think government incentives have disappeared in the US for EVs, and I think they're gone in the UK as well. And I dare say that might be a general trend where there was a lot of incentives, 3-4 years ago, and now they're like, we don't need to, give away these tax dollars anymore. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that happened in 2024 and back end of 23 through 2023 is the interest rate rises in Australia, especially in the US. I don't know the macroeconomic situation in the UK or what interest rates are doing over there, but it's almost like there's been a little bit of a tightening of the belt to try and keep inflation under control. And it's so I think this is actually common knowledge. But and I didn't know this up until recently, but the Reserve Bank can actually see what the population's cash savings are. I when I learned that, it just blew my mind. I thought, what the? And they actually adjust inflation to keep, adjust interest rates to keep people's savings at a particular level, because if people have too many savings, they start spending too much money and then inflation goes up, and then that's just not a great economic situation. So it's like the Reserve Bank controls what your savings are in your bank account. Now, I don't want people to listen to this and then use that as an excuse for not having any savings in the bank. I think that's, I think most people may not have the best control of their personal budgets or eat out too often or, indulge too frequently. But I just found that to be bizarre. So I'd say interest rates and government incentives have gone, and it makes electric vehicles a little bit more expensive to the daily consumer. And so I'd say those are probably the key things that have influenced the decline of automotive vehicles or electric cars. Bikes, still very much an emerging market. Demand has dwindled, especially in the UK. That's what I know. I've been speaking to people over there because those incentives disappeared. But at the same time, there's not an electric bike like ours in the UK market at a price point that ours will be at eventually over there, right? So we can't really compare apples to apples there. So I hope I haven't rambled on too long, but that's pretty much my comprehensive thoughts on it.
All right, let's get down to the nitty-gritty and chat about the product itself. You've called it the C Series Alpha, so please decode this for us. What does this name mean and how did you come up with it? And talk to us a little bit about the performance. So you've got a 16.2 kilowatt battery in the bike, and that gives you a range of slightly over 200 kilometers, if I remember correctly, from the specification you have on your website. How is this performance achieved? And in 2024, how do you think it measures against the competition?
Look, there's no revolutionary technology in our vehicles from a range perspective. We, again, like I said to you before, we're quite a cost-sensitive business, so we're not trying to engineer battery cells that nobody else has. We're using what's most commercially viable for the best power density, energy density that we can get. So um, we're actually quite comparable to other products in the market that are at the same specification. So, and that 200-kilometer quote is a combined range. So it assumes you're in the city for a bit, but you're spending, a good chunk of time on the freeway as well. If you're only on the freeway, you get about 150 Ks because you're not getting much regen back. Um, so, I'd say it's a good range for a motorcycle, especially. But is it, 50% better than the direct competitor? No, we're all about the same. So that's that. Um, and then the branding and the naming. So I've always been interested and passionate about building a big business, and about large scale manufacturing, and big factories have just always been interesting to me. And the C series, C stands for Cafe Racer. It's the style of bike that we've built. The Alpha denotes the variant, so we have the Alpha and the Delta, and they have different performance specifications, different price points. They're just a different offering in the same package, right? Um, so the next bike that and product we eventually bring to market will be a something series as well. So part of wanting to build a big business and larger scale manufacturing is you need to have scalability in your naming conventions, and they need to still sound cool at the same time. So eventually we might do a something series, and that'll be an alpha or delta power or price specification. And then, yeah, we've got a pretty exciting product portfolio, envisioned for the business. Um, so yeah, I hope that answers the question. I tend to ramble and stray a little bit and then forget to actually answer the proper question, but I think I've addressed it.
Oh, don't worry about that. Your ramblings are pretty good, high quality. I'm enjoying it. I'm sure the audience will as well. Hey, you've mentioned earlier that you've got something like 24, 25 different suppliers in your supply chain. How did you go about constructing that supply chain? And is it fairly static and predictable, or does it fluctuate from year to year, forcing you to change your supplier strategy?
It's definitely horses for courses. It's supplier dependent. Supply chain is a living organism. So it's almost like, we've spent 3-4 years developing this product. We've spent probably the same amount of time developing the supply chain, with, marginally the same amount of effort. So you have to dig through so many people that are suppliers, inverted commas, that may not be suppliers, that may be in a different country, that don't speak the same language, that supply the right product at the right price, at the right volume, who are reliable and good to work with and can deliver consistency with quality and so on and so forth. So it's like, you know, going back to the whole who's the right investor and finding the right VC, and those criteria, narrowing things down, to build out a list of 35 good partners to work with, you probably have to comb through a few thousand. And so it takes time and it takes resource. And, I think that's just really the answer to my question is you have to be patient, consistent, and work hard at building a supply chain, and then get your legals in order, make sure your terms are right. Um, and it is really a relationship thing. We've had, and, I've only in the last couple of years truly begun to understand the importance of relationships in business. And I can have a conversation with any of our suppliers. They'll know who I am. If we need a favor, they'll do us a favor. If they need a favor, we'll do them a favor. We're all in business together. So yeah, I think you just my advice to anyone wanting to do a hardware business is just, you know, be a nice person. Don't try and screw your suppliers over, because they can equally do that to you. And just be a good human being, and people will hopefully recognize that.
That's fair enough. Good, simple advice for anyone who's contemplating getting into the production business of any kind. So, when you were dealing with the supply chain, when you were building it out, and then obviously you had successes with some suppliers maybe said no to you. What kind of engineering compromises or design compromises did you have to make, if any at all?
Beggars can't be choosers, right? So we've done our fair share of begging, and if you find a good supplier to work with who has a product that's available that not many other people have at a particular price point, and they're willing to work with you on it, then yeah, sometimes you have the easier path forward is to go with that option and use it as a factor. Like for example, like our power inverter, or the motor inverter is the control unit that takes the energy from the battery and pushes it through the motor. The VCU is the vehicle control unit. We developed that in house. That basically sends a message to the motor control unit to tell it how much power to pull out of the battery and send to the motor, which then gives you your torque and power and whatever. So when it comes to inverter technologies, there's kind of two ways forward until silicon carbide comes in. But there's two ways forward. There's a MOSFET base and there's an IGBT base. I'm kind of going into a bit too much detail, but it's necessary. So IGBT based inverters are 5 to 10 grand a pop. MOSFET based inverters are, 1 to 5 grand. That's kind of like the threshold. But finding an inverter supplier, there's so few people that actually do it, is really hard. And, Sevcon was one really popular back in the day. They did a lot of hobbyist stuff. They eventually sold to Borg Warner. Borg Warner said, we're just targeting big volume, big customers. So the kind of hobbyists, and we were using Sevcon before. That then got sold on to someone else. And then there was this other company in Italy we used. And all these, larger manufacturers that were doing this in more Western countries, they wanted 3 grand a pop. Now, that really throws the economics of our whole cost structure, right? So we have two guys that manage our supply chain. Sorry, three. We've got Alan, Rupy, and Phil. Alan manages our Chinese supply chain, Rupy manages our Indian supply chain, and Phil manages our rest of world supply chain, because we source from Italy and Germany and Poland and what else. So basically, Alan found a supplier in China that does do inverters, but they didn't do the specification we needed. So what we ended up doing is forming a relationship with them, saying, look, we'll invest in this, provided we get to keep some IP and what have you. And we want to work with you to develop what we need at a particular cost. And they did the math and they said, we can do that. And so, I mean, that development process has been incredibly painful, not necessarily because of the relationship. Developing something you've never developed before is always painful. So we're at the tail end of that now. We're pretty much done. But now we have an inverter that doesn't cost us 3 grand a vehicle. It costs us, I can't say, right? That's confidential information. But it's not 3 grand. It's not $500, but it's definitely not 3 grand, right? So it's somewhere in between, and we would have never gotten that cost reduction once we were already in production at a speed that we would need. So we've kind of front loaded that work and that pain to put the business in a better situation down the track. So I think, again, that's just one example of picking a supplier, and designing around it. So the big difference between IGBT and MOSFET is MOSFETs are limited to a maximum of, like, say, 200 volts, roughly speaking. So 200 volts and below. IGBT's up to 800. 800 seems to be like a pretty good sweet spot. And I think there's new tech coming out that lets people go higher. But we had to design a vehicle around 144 volt system. That was our constraint. So that then drives your battery pack, your charger, your inverter, your DC-DC, motor design, so on and so forth. If that component changes, or if we went with a different supplier, our entire vehicle would probably be different. So, yeah, sorry about the long-windedness of that, but it's an interesting story, I hope.
It is a very interesting story indeed. I would think that building a supply chain while trying to do something like this and not having successes building these partnerships that you're talking about, it would knock the wind off your sails quite dramatically.
Yeah.
If you go through cycles of that, you get yourself to a point where, like, I don't want to do this anymore because it's just too difficult. All right, let's move on. You have partially answered this question, but I'm just wondering if there's anything else you can throw into the pot. How do you see the future of e-mobility in Australia, and what role do you envision Savic Motorcycles can play in that future?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, look, I think from the motorcycle market perspective, our vehicle is ideal for people that generally commute or go for a short weekend squirt, to use the old carburetor term, right? Like it is, and no one believes me because I'm the founder. They think I'm just bullshitting and selling the thing all the time. But like people don't realize, like as an engineer, I'm quite objective and I'm incredibly critical of our product. Like I like if it was left up to me, I would never sell the product. I just keep developing it, right? Like I'm just an engineer. And so, like the the way the thing handles, we had an ASBK rider help us with our suspension development. So we developed our own suspension. It handles better than any bike I've ridden. Like it is insane how good this thing is to handle. And it's 280 kilos. So as far as sports bikes are concerned, it's heavy. As far as cruisers, it's a lighter cruiser in effect, but it turns on a dime, and that's a huge credit to Jed Metcher and the team that worked on that suspension development program. The ergonomics are like insanely comfortable. Like it's a cafe racer, but it's quite an upright seated position, so it's very deceptive of comfort. People think cafe painful. Um, so I think as far as the motorcycle market's concerned, we're in an awesome spot, and we're going to start customer test rides in a little bit. And I can't wait for that because everybody that's ridden one has just been absolutely blown away with the thing. They're just like, this is amazing. Like it just as a bike, we've had, some of our younger guys in the team that ride 250s say this handles better than their 250. They go, I wish I learnt on this. But if they drop it, they can't pick it up. That's the problem. So look, I think where the market's going is where nature will take it. Nature and government incentives will take it. I think if the manufacture of electric vehicles was net zero, then it would be silly to not have all vehicles electric operating off solar panels, right? I think if we can get to that place, like I think electric vehicles unlocks the opportunity to have completely sustainable transportation, and I think that's an amazing thing as far as I'm concerned, and I would love to see the market go that way. At the moment, it's especially in Australia, it's an emerging market, but you go to countries like China and the Netherlands and what have you, and it's like there is no road noise there because 50+% of the vehicles on the road are electric. And if you drive a combustion vehicle, it's like dirty, like it's just. And so, in terms of where our business could go, I mean, motorcycles is one thing. There's a lot of market segments that we haven't addressed yet, with our first product. So there's going to be more product in the pipeline to address different market segments and scale manufacturing that way. Our powertrain is really ideal for, ATVs and, more farming type applications and small vehicles, small four-wheeled vehicles. So there could be an opportunity there in time. We don't have anything like that in the pipeline yet, but you know, uh, we're I'd say most likely and almost certainly not will we ever go into cars? Because that's, working at Toyota, one car is $1 billion investment, kind of no matter how you look at it. Luckily, with motorcycles, the compliance requirements as far as crash testing goes are a lot lighter, so it's a lot cheaper to bring something to market. Um, but yeah, I think there is just so much opportunity, and maybe I'm just an optimist, but I'm hugely excited about the future.
I don't really think you'd be able to do what you're doing if you're not an optimist with a positive mindset. Something else I want to ask you in relation to market trends. The traditional bike rider is obviously quite brand loyal. Are you anticipating a gradual shift from traditional to electric at some point in the near future? Like what's your point of view on that?
You can spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to change people's minds about something. And the alternative to that is to be patient and let the market evolve with you. So and this is something that concerns me around, private equity investments. Traditionally speaking, they have a 3-year turnaround time. You need to double or triple the business value they on sell and someone, else. So it's a very aggressive model. Um, Whereas the market's emerging, and no matter how much money you pump into a business, you're not really going to shift the market needle, you know, like that, because it's everybody's individual decision to buy or not, no matter how much advertising money you spend. And it's the reason I laughed before is we live in a small complex, and my next door neighbor, his name actually is Dennis as well, and he's a early 70s lifelong Harley rider. Actually, he's had a lot of bikes over the years, but he still has his Harley, 96 Harley. We'll never sell it. We'll never buy another motorbike. But he also rides an e-bike, like an e-bicycle, and he is absolutely gobsmacked at what we've been developing, and he's stoked that I'm his neighbor and stuff. He gets to look at bikes all the time, um, and he's just like just an amazing human being. But um, what that does signify to me is that yes, there is an older crowd or even a younger crowd, right, that are going to be super brand loyal and loyal to their bike. They love that bike. I think that's awesome. Like I don't want to change that. Like I love a 1968 Mustang as much as the next guy. Like I'd love that. And I think at the end of the day, it's about automotive passion. And I just, if we can contribute to that, and we have, you know, so many pre-orders with so many customers that have been very patient in waiting. And I think one of the best things about the business that we're building is we are potentially going to be a catalyst for someone to feel like that about our bikes. And I think that's possibly why so many people love to work in automotive, because they're contributing to that passion and that interest. And someone buys a vehicle, and in the case of Ford, where I worked, and the ranges that were developed, it's like you're designing that around the family, and it's like that the function and the weekend vehicle and the camping vehicle and what have you, and everybody there was so passionate about that product. And I think it's because of what it meant to so many people. It's very fulfilling.
With delivery starting soon, you have to sort of prepare for this one eventuality that you start putting these bikes on the road and people will notice them and they'll get curious and inquisitive. They might go to the website and put an order, and then your order book, obviously, hopefully that will happen, fingers crossed for you, will explode. So, what does your scale up strategy look like? How are you preparing the kitchen for that?
Yeah, so in terms of scaling, this is a question that I ponder a lot, because you can scale as quickly as you want with a software business, and if there's an issue, you change the software and it's updated for everybody. If you have an issue with a hardware product and a recall is required, that's almost game over, depending on how much cash you've got in the bank, right? Um, so And then we also have this tension between needing to scale at a rate that investors like to see so that we can get more investment, and scaling at a rate that is responsible and careful to make sure that you're not too gung ho and kill the business as a result if there is a recall, which, by the way, is borderline inevitable in every automotive business that's ever started. They've had a recall, right? So, we actually include a recall forecast in our cash flow forecast and our financial modeling. It's just a cost that you've got to have in there. So, the subjectivity around the assumptions of that recall, but um, I don't think keeping the business very, very small for, a certain period of time is unreasonable. The question is, well, what period of time is reasonable? And I don't think the answer is 3 years. I think the answer is probably 12 to 18 months, keeping production steady. But again, the trade off is steady, but you've got to be profitable. You need to make a certain amount to be profitable. So that's kind of like the minimum. So we want to produce at that minimum for a while, which, by the way, is about $20 a month. But if that goes well over a certain period of time, and we're addressing the issues, as you would probably know in Toyota, you have the development team, and then you have a team dedicated to in production issues and problem solving, and it never ends. So depending on how we go over the first 3 to 6 months, we'll look at ramping up from 20. You know, I can't tell you what's in my modeling because it changes all the time. But the reality is, we've got some relationships in the works that mean that our manufacturing and scalability is whatever we want it to be. So I think the other situation we don't want to be in is, we've got these pre-orders. We don't want to produce them in a quarter and generate all this revenue and profit and what have you, and then not produce anything either. That's quite a lot of fluctuation in manufacturing. You kind of have to, you can't, there's too much infrastructure that goes into setting up manufacturing and turning it on and off. And so you kind of want to keep the cogs turning over. So, yeah, I think the reality is we know what we want to start production at. We'll do that for a little while. I can't tell you exactly what that'll be. And then depending on how that journey goes, we'll either we can only really ramp up or stop. So hopefully it's the former.
That's very cool that you're trying to build so much flexibility into the business. I want to ask you about Asia. Have you started contemplating Asia as a potential market for your products? Obviously, if you look at Asia, it's massive populations. In majority of those countries, you've got China, you've got Central Asia, so you've got India, you've got places like Bangladesh, and then, on the east side, you've got Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, places like that. So have you started contemplating a potential move into those markets at some point over the next few years?
I'm looking at every market. So, I've got a spreadsheet of like all of the 182 or 92 countries or whatever it is. And there are a lot of countries that don't make any sense for us to go into, and there's some that make complete sense. I think the reality is for our product portfolio at this time, the markets in the Asian countries are quite small and very niche. And, we're going to be competing against the likes of Harley and Ducati in those markets. The luxury tax on those products is ridiculous in some of those markets. Like they mark them up, like the government marks them up 100%. It's like your tax to bring that product in the door.
Yeah, welcome to Singapore.
Yeah, well, Singapore's a whole different ballgame. But like even in Malaysia, right? Like I think they have 100% on there. And where we can compete in the Asian markets is they have EV incentives that remove importation taxes, right? So we can be very competitive against the bigger players. But then you've got to consider pricing psychology, and are people going to think our product is cheaper because it's not priced the same, as a petrol competitor and what have you. But it's a different story. I think the volume isn't going to be there in Asia for our product up front. And so that's kind of why we're not focusing on the Asian markets right now. The main growth markets that we see for us in our next step is the European markets. In terms of disposable income, customer profile, it's quite similar to the Australian market. Um, Despite different languages across Europe and France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK, or even just France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. That's the four countries all under EU regulations. So you've got one homologation process, and that's 80% of the European motorcycle market. So, and then you've got the UK, slightly different homologation rules, but a good sized market and a market where cafe races really do make sense as well, right? So. Um, we see our initial phase one growth on the pathway to becoming that future big business. We see that in those countries, in the European countries and the UK. So in time, when our product portfolio is bigger, maybe we've got some lower cost products in our portfolio. That's when the Asian markets are really going to become more suitable.
Mm,
Again, I hypothesize, but that's what we think.
okay. Now,
Oh, sorry. I'll just add one thing. I know I'm probably going way over time here, but you mentioned Kawasaki and those other guys and how they're not boldly going into it. And I think what a lot of people, you definitely understand this concept, having an automotive background, but a lot of general population don't necessarily understand profit pool cannibalization, right? And producing petrol motorcycles and petrol vehicles in general is insanely cheap. Like it is, the average person doesn't have a clue at what the markups are on cars and motorcycles, and the cost of aluminium per kilo at the material level is like $5 a kilo, steel's $1. So if your bike was entirely aluminium, which is 5 times cheaper than a car, you've got 200 kilos. That's $1,000 of material in a 200 kilo completely aluminium bike. So and people are paying 60 grand for a Harley, which is also steel, and so it's like, there's a lot of markups and there's a lot of factors that influence those markups. There's manufacturing process and what have you. But at the fundamental level, it's our cell cost for 16 kilowatt hours of battery cells is like 4,000 US just for the cells before you put them in a battery pack, before you put them in the bike. So, it's a lot more expensive to produce electric vehicles. And so if someone like a Kawasaki or let's say Honda, right, who produce 20 million two-wheeled vehicles a year, can either sell a much cheaper option or a more expensive option for the same volume, they're just eating into their bottom line. For what? And so as a big business, it makes absolutely no sense to go into the e-motorcycle space, period, because it just doesn't. And in fact, there was an article that came out. I don't know if they quoted him directly. I think they might have, where the BMW motorcycle CEO said, "We're not even looking at this space. It doesn't make." And they've got the electric scooter. Maybe that makes sense for the commuter that has more income and wants that particular vehicle to commute to work on. But yeah, in terms of performance motorcycles, it doesn't make any sense at all unless you're direct customer.
let's pivot a little bit and talk about government support. I'm really curious to hear from you if the government, either local or federal, has done anything at all to support your business, giving you a tax break or any financial support to get your business going. And if the government hasn't done anything at all, what do you think needs to change to encourage young people to follow your footsteps and just be more comfortable setting new businesses up, not being afraid to fail? Like, what do you think needs to change?
That's a really good question. So in terms of what we've received, there's a thing called the R&D tax claim. And so if you're developing new technology in Australia, in a new business, you can claim 50% of, not 50 exactly, it's a smaller percentage, but roughly half of that back as a tax deduction. And if you're not a profitable business, the government actually gives you that back in cash which you can then reinvest into R&D. So that's been amazing. We've used that every year. I'm going to be very, very sad for that to go away when we actually are profitable, but that's a good problem to have. Then we did tap into EMDG, which is the Export Markets Development Grant, and they do a similar thing for marketing spend that you make overseas, of which we haven't had any. So we did set it up, but we never ended up investing in international marketing because we can't supply them yet, so there's no point. We have applied for state level and federal grants. We've applied to every grant that we remotely fit the bill for. One that we got, AMGC, the Australian Manufacturing Growth Centre grant, that was the best grant program that we've been a part of. They ran that incredibly well. Huge props to Jens and the team over there. That grant was a game changer for our business. It was we submitted a project of 1.2 million roughly, and half of that came from the grant, half of that came from equity financing. Friends, family, angels, and that got us to a point where we got our first road registered bike. So we had a prototype, we got the ABS, we got all the compliance done. That was a huge milestone, and that wouldn't have happened without that grant. And that was brilliant. That was a federal grant. We've had also Invest Victoria give us a loan against our R&D claim, which is a pretty common practice nowadays. And they ran a promotional campaign. We borrowed a few $100,000. We paid that back. So that's all done and dusted. So that's kind of like the support that we've had from the Australian government. In terms of what the government could do, that's a can of worms. And I think a lot of people ask, the government for a lot of things. I need this, I need that, and I've never really been that way inclined. The only thing I'll mention is something I have seen in another market that absolutely blew my mind, and in China, right? And I'm not going to say I'm I'm neutral. I'm not super for the Chinese government. I'm not super against. This is a program that they have, right? Which I thought was amazing. And that program is, if you come to them with a business plan, that makes sense, and they have obviously a vetting process. The government will actually loan you enough money for a factory, for equipment, and for workers without any repayments for the first 3 years. And what they expect of you is to generate enough revenue and enough profit by year 4 that the tax of your profit repays your initial loan. It's like they're literally saying, if you have a good business model and we believe you, go get cracking, build that business, and they obviously, that you've got milestones, they track you, quarterly. How's your financials going? How's your blah blah blah. And we haven't tapped into this. It's just something I've learned about, and it's like, how can you not manufacture there? What other government in their right mind would do that? And you can only imagine, the opportunity for fraud and all this kind of stuff that can arise from that. I'm not going to go down, the consequences of that and that pathway, right? But I think, like, what an incredible scheme, and then I see the Australian government, and I'm not bagging them or anything like that. I mean, but you see billions of dollars go into a project, and you're like, how many jobs is this going to create? Like, what's the actual return to the gross GDP on this investment? Like, nuclear submarines and $300 billion. That I don't know if that program's still going ahead or not. But have you been strong armed by another country to do that? Like, what? what kind of economic sense does that make? And you talk about national security, and yes, national security is important, and um, and then I looked at that, right, and I was like, well, why would someone make that investment? All this kind of stuff, and eventually the horrific reasoning and conclusion you come to is to keep peace is the threat of war, right? So it's like, what keeps the peace? The ability to destroy each other. So maybe let's not do that, right? Um, so it's like, okay, maybe they made the decision for that reason, but $300 billion, you know how many people that can feed, house, how many businesses that can build, what that can do to your GDP if you invest it in the right places? Holy moly. I'm trying not to swear on this show, but like that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, we've built a business that has the potential to grow into a couple of $1 billion business over a certain period of time. Um, and we got started with 5 million. We've had 5 million over 5 years to build a production electric motorcycle. 5 million Australian, right? So 3 million US. It's like that is absolutely nothing. And granted, that's definitely an anomaly. Like our team have been incredibly resourceful. We've done a lot with very little, but even still, imagine if we had 50 million. Imagine what we could have done with 50 if we've done this with 5. So I just think there is things that the government can do that may be a lot more conducive for businesses and GDP in Australia. Um, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced, democracy is the best pathway to actually get that done, because someone has to make a decision and not worry about if that's going to influence their vote, them getting voted in next term or whatever. Um, but when you have a vision and an objective and something you want to achieve over a certain period of time, you need someone to just make that call and to make that happen. And, I don't know if our political system allows that.
Well, I could not disagree with that statement at all. At the end of the day, if you look at China, they have a 100-year plan and they're executing that plan very, very consequentially.
100%.
Compare that to the politics in the West. Everyone's kind of obsessed with these 4 or 5 year cycles, playing political football. So even if you have an administration that's going to pass some really interesting pro small business, pro innovation policies, the next administration will come in and invert those policies. They will cancel them out just because of political gamesmanship. And unlike 15, 20 years ago, what's coming out of China now, it's actually quite impressive. Like the product is really, really slick.
Yeah.
And you can see that in electronics industry and particularly in the EV space. Like the cars coming out of China, they are getting better and better. And it's quite impressive what they are managing to do so quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people forgot about what happened with Japan. You go back 40 years, Japan was where China was 20 years ago. And now when you talk about it, and people used to say, oh, that crap made out of Japan. No one would say that now. They go, oh, Japanese, that's quality, man. That is so good. And, you know, I was talking to, I'm very, very fortunate to have some awesome mentors. Um, and, having worked at Ford, some of them come from Ford. And, I have a monthly pontification session with this guy, and we just talk about anything and everything. And we talked about Chinese automotive manufacturing. And he said, and I agree with him, is that China is now producing cars better than the US probably ever will
Oh,
again.
100%.
Period.
Period.
And it's like, I don't think people have realized that yet, or maybe not the right people. And maybe they can produce the same, but at what cost as well? The economics won't stack up. So it's like the government investments with the right vision in the right place can absolutely transform an entire economy. And we have the resources, physically in the ground and intellectually in Australia to do that. But the incentivization and how that incentivization operates, I think is an interesting problem.
I think this would be a good place for us to bring this thing home. Tell me, how do you place an order for one of your bikes? And is it possible to test drive it at all?
So in terms of putting an order in, super easy. Head to our website, savicmotorcycles.com. We have an online configurator there. So we do want to update the website and make it a bit more streamlined, but you go to the configurator, you design your bike, it takes you through the process and you put an order in. So it's pretty straightforward and it's kind of fun too. In terms of test rides, we haven't started test rides yet. We've only had a handful of people outside of the company test ride the vehicles. We're hoping to kind of scale up. We've built and the customer test riders are built, ready to go. And again, I mentioned that software issue before. As soon as that software issue is sorted, we're getting as many bums on seats as we possibly can. So we plan on having a permanent test ride vehicle in our Victorian, flagship store. And then 2 bikes will then travel the country and go state to state. So yeah, look, as soon as we're able to offer that, our customers and our audience will definitely hear about it.
That's really awesome, Dennis. It must have been the most arduous journey, I'm imagining, to get to this point. But now you are at a place where you have a showroom, you offering test drives, you'll start your deliveries, and the future is looking bright. Which is an amazing achievement. I do want to congratulate you here. You've done really well with your team. Before we wrap this up, can you tell the audience how can people follow you? What's the best way to follow Savic Motorcycles, get across the latest developments and news?
Insta's great. We use Insta all the time. Same as Facebook. LinkedIn. We're on LinkedIn. We have a newsletter that goes out. So if you're on our website, just subscribe to that and that'll keep you posted of everything that's going on. And if you have any questions, just info@savicmotorcycles.com and one of the team will get back to them.
Thank you, Dennis. For the audience, I'm going to put all those links into the show notes so you can find them there. As for today, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed talking to you. Great insights. Thanks, I've actually learned a few things from you. Great perspectives. From what you told me, it sounds like you are surrounded by a fantastic team and just generally great people and family around you. I don't need to tell you this, but you are doing incredibly well. And I sincerely hope that you just keep going and do not give up no matter what happens.
Just keep going. That's our motto for sure. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Absolute pleasure, Dennis. Look after yourself and all the best with the business.